join our voices together in song, and to think that there's people all over this world doing the same thing is truly amazing. I'm going to turn on my mic, huh, Curtis? There we go. Okay. But it is amazing to know that there's Christians all over this world right now, whether they be gathered in church buildings, whether they be gathered in homes, they're worshiping God with that same voice today. The reason we picked those songs about worshiping God and the fact that He alone is worthy of worship is I want to present an idea to you this morning. And this idea isn't new to you, most likely. You've probably thought through this before. But the idea is that I think a lot of us, most of the time, wish we were God. Now, I don't mean that in the sense that we wish that we had all the responsibilities of God, because that would be too much to bear. But we wish that we had His authority. We wish that we could do what He does. We wish that we were the ultimate authority figure. And you think about historically, mankind has struggled with this idea from the beginning. In the Garden of Eden, when the serpent came to the woman and tempted her, he said, "You shall not surely die," when he tried to get her to eat of that forbidden fruit, right? He said, "For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." Now, we don't normally talk about that part of this temptation, but it's based around this idea of you'll get to be like God. So when they ate of the fruit, in some way, they're trying to be like God. They wanted to become God in some way, and we do the same thing. Now, we might not go around saying, "I want to be like God," but by our behaviors, we prove otherwise. We see this idea of us wanting to become our own God when it comes to like selfishness. You think about it. When you have the attitude that it has to be your way, that's you pretending to be God. When you think it has to be the way you like it, when your relationship has to be on your terms, whether it be a friendship or in your marriage, if you have to always have your way, you think you're God. If you always have to have your way in the church better work its activities, plans, and schedules and so on around you, you think you're God. And in fact, when we act selfishly, we turn ourselves into the object of service and even sometimes worship. This is a problem. And the famous line from the movie Rudy, the priest there is talking to Rudy, and he tells him this. He says, in all these years of study, he says, I've come to one conclusion. And the conclusion is there is a God, and I'm not Him. However, we live our life like we think we are God. You think about the Ten Commandments. Later on, after we had Adam and Eve fall into the temptation of trying to be like God, you fast forward into the book of Exodus. Moses is helping with God, deliver the people out of Egypt. And he goes before God on Mount Sinai, and God gives him the law of Moses that was going to be the law for the Jewish people all the way up until the time of Christ. And the first command in the Ten Commandments is, you shall have no other gods before me. Over and over again, you see the temptation and the command that refutes that temptation to not have any other gods. But here's what we do. We take ourselves and we turn ourselves into an object of worship. When we worship a false god, it is because we are living like we are God. If we make ourselves into that object of worship, we are sinning. Now, we would never, ever usually say, everybody worship me. We wouldn't say that. But what we do say is, everybody do what I want. Everybody give me what I think I need. And everybody treat me the way that I feel that I deserve. As opposed to thinking about others. When we do that, we make ourselves into an object of worship. With that thought in mind, this morning, open up your Bibles to the book of Acts. And if you're tuning in online, let me encourage you to do the same thing. We're continuing our study of the book of Acts this morning. And it's a book that tells the story of the early church. Jesus has already come to the earth. He preached, he healed, he performed many miracles. He goes to the cross, he dies, he resurrects from the grave 3 days later, the foundation of Christianity. He spends a short while with his followers, and then he ascends to heaven, await his final return. What he does then is he sends his followers to go out and to make Christians. And they do that, and they convert people, Jew and Gentile alike. And two of those prominent preachers in the early church were men by the name of Paul and men by the name of Barnabas. And they're preaching now in the area which would be modern-day Turkey, Asia Minor, in the Greek world. So in Acts chapter 14, starting in verse 8, we're going to pick up here in just a moment. But to summarize where we're at, it begins in this section that Paul and Barnabas are preaching and about the grace of God. They're doing all these wonders and signs, and they're converting all sorts of people. They're converting Jews, and they're also converting Gentiles. Now that's huge, because early on, people thought that Christianity was just another movement within Judaism, but it wasn't. It's a belief system, it's a faith, it's a movement for the entire world. So Paul and Barnabas are preaching this message, and they're converting Jews and Gentiles. But what happens is that some of the Jewish leaders didn't like this. They got upset at the idea of people coming to Jesus. So they conspire with some of the Gentiles and try to get the crowd to go against them and try to kill them. But what happens is Paul and Barnabas find out about this plot against them. They leave before it's too late, and they travel to Lystra. And when they get to Lystra, they spend time in the region there preaching and doing miracles. And that's where we're going to pick up in verse 8 today. Let's read Acts chapter 14, verse 8. At Lystra, a man was sitting who had no strength in his feet, lame from his mother's womb, who had never walked. So here we are in a Gentile city, a Greek city, and here you have a man, assumingly of Greek background because of what takes place next. This man has a disability. This man from birth has not been able to walk. Everybody knew about this disabled man. But this man in verse 9, he listens to Paul. It says, this man was listening to Paul as he spoke, who when he had fixed his gaze on him, had seen that he had faith to be made well. So Paul's preaching and telling people about Jesus, and they're performing different miracles, things, and this crippled man is watching. This crippled man is listening. He's learning about the true God. And Paul sees him. He sees his attentiveness. He sees the connection that is being made. He sees this man's faith. And you know what? From a preaching standpoint, you have those moments when you're preaching. I mean, I know everybody's listening and all that, trying their best, but sometimes you can tell that you're really connecting with somebody, and this person's engaged. That's what's going on right here. And this man has faith. So Paul says to him with a loud voice in verse 10, he said, stand up on your feet. And what does it say? It says the man leaped up and began to walk. This man who had been crippled from birth is healed by the power of God through the Apostle Paul. He leaps up and he starts to walk, and the crowds see this. Now, that by itself alone shows the power of God working through Paul. It shows that God cares about both Jew and Gentile. There's so much there. But the crowd sees what happens. They see this miracle. I mean, this is not a huge city. This is a town that would have known this crippled man. And they see that the man is now able to walk. And not only just walk, he leaps up and begins to walk. So a man that never even knew how to walk is able to leap and walk. Shows how huge this miracle is. Well, in verse 11, the crowd saw this. The crowd saw what Paul had done, and they raised their voice. And you're thinking, great, they're going to praise God. But they don't. They don't. Here's what they do. So Paul just performed this miracle. The crowd sees it, and they raise their voice, and in the Lycaonian language, they proclaim, the gods have become like men and have come down to us. Hold up, that's the problem, right? What are they doing? They're not praising the true God. They're not wanting to follow Jesus. They're praising their gods. In fact, verse 12, they begin calling Barnabas Zeus and Paul Hermes because he was the chief speaker. So now they're taking Greek god names and giving them to the apostles. See, these are a Greek-speaking world. This is the Greek world. They're used to worshiping their Greek gods. When you were in school, you probably learned about them, right? Well, here, they see what Paul and Barnabas are doing. They say, you know what? You're not Barnabas, you're Zeus, come down from the heavens. And you're not Paul, you're Hermes because you're the chief speaker. So now they're praising their false gods while trying to worship Paul and Barnabas. This is a problem. And it goes on. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city. See, we always think that, well, in the first century you had Judaism and then you had Christianity. No, there was so much other religion going on. And the Gentiles here had their churches too. And their churches and their temples were to people like Zeus. So the priest of Zeus, he had his priests too, was just outside the city, brought oxen and garlands, that's like wreaths, to the gates, and he wanted to offer sacrifice with the crowds. So the crowd has gone wild, which, by the way, they don't believe in Jesus yet, but they can at least acknowledge the miracle. So they convinced, the Greeks here who worship false gods that they were, had power here. They saw it, but when they saw the power, their natural reaction was to turn Paul and Barnabas into gods and offer sacrifice to Zeus and to them. It's all bad. It's not how it's supposed to be. And when the apostles, verse 14, and Paul heard of it, what did they do? It says they tore their robes and rushed into the crowd, crying out. And here's what they cried out. They said, "Men, why are you doing these things? We are men of the same nature as you. We preach the gospel to you that you should turn from these vain things to a living God who made the heaven, the earth, and the sea, and all that is in them." So Paul and Barnabas see what is about to happen, and they're distraught. They rip their robes, they run on in there. I picture them bum rushing people, hitting them with their shoulders too. That's just what I see in my mind. But they're coming, running on in there, trying to get these people to stop it. Stop it, you can't do this. Don't call us gods. Don't worship Zeus. Don't worship Hermes. In fact, he says, why are you doing this? You shouldn't be worshiping those gods at all. You shouldn't be worshiping us. We are men just like you. The only reason that we are here is to get you to turn away from these vain things. What vain things? Idol worship. Your false god worship. Sacrifices to Zeus and Hermes. We're trying to get you to stop all of these things and instead worship the God who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. Paul and Barnabas had an opportunity to walk in there like gods. They could have walked in there and had fame and had fortune and had whatever they wanted. And as humans, that sounds pretty good, right? We want that fame. We want that power. We want that influence. We want that following. Paul and Barnabas ran in there and tried to get them to stop. And they took the glory that was being offered to them and pointed it up to God. And said, you need to be following the true God who made the heaven and the earth and the sea. And then he goes on and he preaches to them. In verse 16, he says, in the generations gone by, he permitted all the nations to go their own ways. You wonder, how come God, why is there in the Old Testament only emphasis on the Jewish people? Because God let the other nations kind of do their own thing. Now, he held them accountable to some certain standards. The Bible doesn't speak a lot about that because, by the way, the Old Testament is the story of one particular family line, not the entire world. But what we find out in verse 17, it says, yet he did not leave himself without witness, in that he did good and gave you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your heart with food and gladness. So Paul says, even though there wasn't a lot of emphasis on the other nations, God did leave you with truth. He gave you rains. He gave you seasons. You should be able to know that there is a God in the heavens. There's evidence out there. And even today, the best evidence we have for God is God's creation. So he says, you should have known about the true God. So he preaches this message to them. But even after he preaches this message, it says, even with these words, they had difficulty keeping the crowd from sacrificing to them. They do a miracle. They preach a message of Jesus. The crowd reacts, and many of them wanted to react in a false way by turning Paul and Barnabas into gods. Now, this is a difficult situation for them to unfold. This is difficult for the crowds. This is difficult for Paul and Barnabas. But the point that I want us to see is that they could have made themselves into objects of worship, but they didn't. They could have made themselves into gods. The crowds would have let them. And you know what? There's people out there that'll let you live selfish lives and act like you're God. There's enablers out there. There's people that'll do that, but we cannot make ourselves into objects of worship. Only God is worthy of worship. So let's ask the question, how would have we reacted to the same crowd? If you had all those people there bowing down before us, what would we have done? You see similar scenes like this when someone all of a sudden becomes popular and receives fame. Someone becomes a musician of some kind or an actor that has a lot of fame, and now all of a sudden, let's say it's a guy, they can have any woman they want. It's a girl, any guy they want. They can have money, they can have popularity, they can go to all the parties, they can be in every scene. And how would we react if that was there before us? Would we react like Paul and Barnabas and say, stop? Or would we go, you know what? Maybe I am someone special. Maybe I am deserving of this attention. Now, maybe that's a little bit too grandiose in the way that we're looking at this, but we do the same thing. When we don't get what we want, how do we react? Do we react as if we're a God that deserves everything they ever want? Or do we realize that we are created by a God who deserves our worship, honor, and praise? See, we worship a false God when we live as if we were God. The point today is, do not make yourself into an object of worship. And think about the argument that Paul makes here in Acts chapter 14. The argument that he makes centers around creation. Basically saying that, look, we, Paul and Barnabas, are not the creators of the universe. And a lesson for us is we are not the creators nor the center of the universe. It doesn't all revolve around us. It's not all about us. It's all about Him. There is one God, and we are not Him. So the lesson for us today is this. Let's live for, serve, and praise the true God, and not self. When we act selfishly, we act as if we're God. Not that God is selfish, but we act like we're deserving of what He can receive. When we always want our way, we make ourselves into an object of honor and worship. When we force others to do always what we want, we act like we're better than everybody else, and maybe we're starting to elevate ourselves on a throne that we do not belong. We need to live for, serve, and praise the true God, and God alone, and not self. The lesson is yours today. In just a moment, we're going to be singing a song. My encouragement for those of you that are here in person or tuned in online is to this week, this month, and for the rest of our lives, let's make sure that the only one that we worship, the only one that we bow down to, is God. The lesson is yours. Let's all stand and sing together.